We are getting into our keynote today, and to introduce our speaker, I will allow Danielle Rochelle to take over, who is the Director of IDA.
Good morning, everybody. Okay, so I'm here this morning. I have to remember it's morning. I'm here this morning to introduce our speaker for today. I'm really excited about this one because when I first received her email and her focus was on natural hair, I mean, obviously, that's kind of one of the things I'm really passionate about. And so having her on campus today really means a lot for myself as well as others who are in the room today. All right, so Clair Detrick-Jules is an award-winning filmmaker, photographer, author, activist, and public speaker. She captures personal stories and intimate moments centering Black liberation, immigrant justice, and women's rights. An Afro-Caribbean artist who remains rooted in her community, Clair grounds her work in radical love, joy, and the knowledge that a more just world is possible. Clair has a BA from Brown University in French and Francophone Studies. I did have to ask her what that meant because I have not seen Francophone studies before. She has been featured in the Washington Post, Washingtonian Magazine, BuzzFeed News, the Christian Science Monitor, Birdie, and NPR's Strange Fruit, among others. Her documentary, Documented, has received awards at Immigration Film Fest, Baltimore International Black Film Festival, Ogden City Latino Film Festival, and Cornell University's Centrally Isolated Film Festival. Her books, My Beautiful Black Hair and My Hair is Like the Sun, showcase the beauty of natural Black hair. Clair currently resides in her hometown of Washington, D.C., and this morning we have the pleasure of hearing from her today. Let's give her a round of applause.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I am really excited to join you all today and to talk a little bit about my work. And I did get to hear the panel earlier this morning and really grateful for a lot of the things that people said. And I was taking notes as well, because I think that there are so many intersections in terms of storytelling, in terms of vulnerability that I want to touch on today as well. So as I get started, there's a couple things that I want you all to think about that I've been thinking about a lot recently. And again, this was sort of talked about in the panel as well, and it has to do with storytelling. So the first thing I want you all to think about is how many times, especially in your academic careers, how many times you've been discouraged from using the first person in your writing. So think about how many times you've been discouraged from using the word I because it weakens your writing, because it makes your writing less powerful, because it makes your writing less objective and more subjective, right? Think about how many times you've been discouraged from using your own personal voice in your work. And then the second thing I want you all to think about, again, something that was really talked about on the panel as well, is what happens when we do have the opportunity to share our first person stories. And in particular, what happens when people from marginalized communities, people whose stories have been historically silenced, what happens when we get to share our voices and to have our stories be heard and valued and seen? And so with that being said, I am going to talk a little bit about my work with Black hair today. But before I jump into that, I want to do sort of a quick activity, just as sort of a warm up. And so I'm going to ask everybody, if you have a piece of paper and pen, to take out a piece of paper and pen. If not, you can just use your phone or something else to write with. And I just want everybody to take a minute and write down something that you love about yourself. It can be a part of your physical identity. It can be part of your psychological identity, whatever it is. Write down one thing you really love about yourself. And then I also want you to write down one thing you don't quite yet love about yourself, but that you're learning to love. So again, that can be a part of your identity, part of your personality. Does anybody have any questions, or is it pretty clear? Good. All right. If anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand. So we'll just take a minute for that.
I would always get my hair constantly straightened because I thought that's what beauty was, that's what beautiful meant.
All right, and as people begin to wrap up with what you're writing, if you're still writing, that's okay, you can continue. But for those who are finished, I would love for you guys to turn to a partner or a group of three, however it works out with your tables. And if you feel comfortable and would like to share, I would love for you guys to share in small groups. No pressure if you don't want to share. Feel free to keep it private as well. We'll take maybe one more minute to share and then come back together. All right, everyone. I really hate to interrupt these conversations, but I would love to come back together as a group and give people the chance to share with the group. If anybody would like to share what they were talking about with everybody, does anybody want to share?
For me, the thing that I've learned to love about myself, because I've been natural my whole life, but it's always been straightened. Like I've always gone through the whole heat process, whatever. And so I got to a point where I was like, I'm keeping my hair in braids or twists all the time at this point, so I might as well just lock it. And I had some resistance and some struggle, some internal struggle with it, but once I finally did it and committed to it, I felt completely different about my hair. I no longer looked at my hair as a burden or a chore. It was just, this is a part of me where my hair grows naturally. And even when it's super frizzy and you can't see the parts anymore, I'm like, it still looks good. I'm still okay with walking out like this. And the parts of me that I'm learning to love are, I have to admit that a lot of it is based on the external messaging about like weight and stretch marks and things like that. But in reality, I have a lot of this stuff because of the kids that I brought into this world. And so getting to a place where I feel more comfortable about why my body looks the way that it does and being okay with that and at peace with that.
Thank you so much for sharing. Does anybody else want to share?
All right. So something that I like about myself is my sense of humor, my ability to make people laugh, just because you never know what anybody's going through at home or like at work or something. So being able to make somebody laugh. Something that I'm struggling or like building to learn to love is my hair, because just like the previous person said, like I've always had it straightened or had it in braids or like had it in ways that I didn't like. So when I turned 18, I like cut it and started wearing it how I wanted to.
Thanks for sharing. Anyone else?
I think one thing I really appreciate about myself is that I'm always wanting to be engaged and that like I'm always trying to do more and more. I'm always like have a full schedule of workshops, panels, events, and everything that I can possibly do because that kind of is how I feel. That's how I find the meaning in my life is being fulfilled by doing a bunch of stuff, feeling like I'm out in the community. One thing kind of relatable to everybody is that as a trans woman, it's kind of hard to want to do my hair every day, do my makeup every day, dress super feminine because you have that fear component of everything that goes on in Tennessee. And then you have to kind of like, just dealing with my hair is just been a struggle because I can never find a place where it looks good. Like I always feel like I have to change it to make it look better, more feminine. So just being able to like accept my body for what it is and just now that I've gone through a lot of surgeries and stuff, now I've kind of gone to a point where I do accept that I am who I am and that kind of like what Danielle was talking about, there's those messaging in the community, like what you need or should be or what you should have. And then I have to learn to accept that I am what I am. So.
Thanks. I love that you've gotten to a place of self-acceptance. Anyone else? Oh, over here.
It's okay. I'm running a workout in the background, so I get all this credit. I'm happy to run around the room. Hello. I'm Tyrus Watkins. I go to University of Memphis. I'm the president for Stonewall Tigers. I just felt like I should probably introduce myself before saying my positive and negatives, and pros and cons about myself. One thing I do like is my locks. I love my locks. I've been grateful to have them ever since I've met my loctician. Yeah, because unfortunately I cannot do it by myself. I don't know how anyone can manage to do their hair and have a busy schedule. If you have any tips, I would love to hear that. But it takes hours to do my hair. But I can do it in many styles and different ways, and I love the diversity that comes with just having locks. And plus I can go to sleep and put a button on, I have to worry about it the next day. Just take it off and boom, there you go. And one thing I don't like about myself is, well, I'm working on, is my lack of commitment. One thing I value most in life is freedom. And I think in some ways, commitment is a restriction, could be a restriction of freedom. And I think that with that fear, it limits my ability to actually experience life in a fulfilling way. So I'm working on that. I think that if I commit to something I actually enjoy, then it won't be, limiting. So that's one way I can escape that kind of paradox. But yeah.
Thank you. All right. Anyone else? All right. Thank you guys so much for sharing with each other and then for those who shared with the group as well. So I'm going to share a story about self-love that has to do with my little sister, Chloe. So this is her on the screen. We are obviously many, many, many years apart, 18 to be exact. And when she was just 4 years old, she came home from school one day crying because she was going to a majority white pre-K school, and her majority white classmates had bullied her about her afro. They told her that her afro was ugly. They told her that her curls looked like little pieces of shrimp. They were really, really mean to her about her hair. And so she came home from school that day crying. She told my dad and my stepmom that she no longer wanted to go to that school anymore because she was so embarrassed and ashamed about her hair, and she didn't want people to see her hair. And this was really heartbreaking for me. First of all, you never want to see anybody who you love struggle or be sad. And it was also really heartbreaking because it sort of brought me back to a time in my life where I also really felt like I didn't belong because of my hair. So this was me when I was younger. And similar to my sister Chloe, I also spent many years of my childhood in a majority white elementary school. And so I think that, especially what we heard on the panel today as well, I think almost everybody, probably everybody in this room can relate to that feeling of being out of place for whatever reason, right? Feeling like we don't fully belong where we are. And I think that it's so common to have this longing to belong, especially when we're part of marginalized communities. And it can be hard to find people around us who look like us, who embrace us, who share these identities with us. And so even though my elementary school, my majority white classmates, unlike my sisters, they didn't bully me about my hair. They were kind to me, but I still had this understanding that there was something fundamentally different about me as a little biracial Black kid among mostly white students. And so I also really developed a lot of, I would say, self-hatred around this part of my identity, around this Blackness, around this thing that made me different from others. And so I spent many years waking up every morning and looking in the mirror and just wishing that I could see straight hair reflected back at me. And so it was such a long journey for me to learn to accept this part of me, to learn to love my natural hair. But it took me many years. And again, this was something that we heard on the panel today, was for some people how long it took to fully embrace their most authentic selves, right? Whatever that means to you. And so for me, it took me many years, and I didn't want my sister Chloe to have to go through the same process of spending years really hating this fundamental piece of herself, really hating her hair. And so I wanted to give her that representation because it is so important to recognize that even though you may be in a particular space where you don't see many people who are like you in your immediate community, it's so important to recognize that there actually are people who are just like you out there, and you just have to find them. And so I decided that I was going to give my sister the sense of representation that she wasn't necessarily getting in her school, obviously. She also wasn't getting in her neighborhood, which is not very diverse either. She wasn't getting representation from mainstream media, which, as we know, doesn't feature too many little Black kids with afros. And even within our own family, there's 4 of us siblings, and my sister Chloe has the tightest curl pattern. And so even within our own family, she doesn't necessarily see anybody who looks exactly like her. And so I decided that I wanted to do something to show her that her natural hair is beautiful. And so again, something that was talked about earlier was this question of how to know when to get involved in certain topics in, the social justice community. When and where do we decide to fight for our, collective liberation as people in marginalized communities with marginalized identities? And so for me, that catalyst was really my sister. I don't think I would have gotten into this work if it weren't for her and my love for her. And so what I decided to do was to go around and start photographing and interviewing Black women and girls about their natural hair journey. And my focus was on Black women because I'm a Black woman. My sister is growing into a Black woman. But I also think it's so important to recognize that everybody has a hair story. In the Black community, I think hair is really significant, and also for other communities as well. I think hair for a lot of us can be a large part of our identities and how we see ourselves, how we portray ourselves to the world. And so, and as we heard, when people were talking about things that they love about themselves or that they're still learning to love about themselves, for a lot of us across different backgrounds, it can be really hard to figure out how to love our hair in its natural state. And so I interviewed all of these women. Here are some of the women who I interviewed, 6 out of the 101. And I asked these women how, why, when they went natural, how they learned to love themselves completely, how they learned to love their natural hair in a society where natural Black hair is not always seen as beautiful or professional or worthy of love. And so I asked them, how they found that courage within themselves to embrace their natural hair. And some of these women shared that they had classmates, friends, community members, sometimes even family members who were really unsupportive of their decision to wear their hair in its natural state. And so I asked them, right, how they found it within themselves to love themselves. And I put all of their stories and photos together in my photojournalism book, My Beautiful Black Hair, 101 Natural Hair Stories from the Sisterhood. And so as I was collecting all these stories, I did film a lot of them because I thought I might turn this into a documentary, and that didn't end up happening, but I did end up with a good amount of footage from these interviews. And so I'm going to share some of that footage with you all. And so the first video that I'll share, and if you want to pull up the first videos, I know we're like switching computers here. But so the first video that I'll share features some of these women talking about self-love and the natural hair movement. And in case anybody is unfamiliar with what it means in the Black community to go natural or do the big chop, for the most part, within the Black community, especially among Black women, but everybody, it's pretty common to get what's called a perm or a relaxer. And so this is something that chemically straightens your hair. And so once you get this relaxer, there's no way to get rid of it. The only way to get rid of it, you can't just wash it out. You actually have to cut off all of the hair that's been chemically relaxed and start over and wait for your natural hair to grow back out. And so for a lot of the women who I talked to, they said that this moment of going natural was a really pivotal moment in many of their lives. And so I'm going to share this first video with you all, if you could play it. Thank you.
I would always get my hair constantly straightened because I thought that's what beauty was, that's what beautiful meant. Natural is coming back, and I love that. I started getting into it, and I was like, Mom, I'm gonna catch it. Your hair holds so much power within yourself. The apple can be political, but it can also have this wonderful aesthetic quality. The artistry we want to say just extends through your properties. A part of who you are. Now I honestly love my curls, but it's probably getting you. The bigger my hair gets, the more beautiful I think it is. It's a symbol to me also of like freedom. It defies gravity. I don't know, sort of like a revolutionary thing.
All right, and then if you could pull up the second video. So this second video features some of the women, again, this time talking directly to my little sister, Chloe. So one of the things that I asked these women to do was to think about when they were Chloe's age, when they were 4 or 5 years old, and what are some of the things that they would have wanted or needed to hear at that time. And so this is some of the words of encouragement and love that the women offered to my sister.
Hi, Chloe. Hi, Chloe. It's a little Miss Chloe. You have amazing hair. It's just so naturally beautiful. Your hair is absolutely gorgeous. You are beautiful. You are seen. I mean, Chloe, I was you once. It was hard to believe myself to be worthy when the people around me, convinced me otherwise. Growing up, I wish I had a sister or somebody who told me that I'm beautiful the way that I am. You know what else I would say? Something else I would say is that we're all different and that's okay. Don't be afraid to be you. Your hair is definitely a part of you, so let it be a part of your spirit. Your hair will love you if you love it. You'll grow with it. You'll learn. Chloe, stay natural, baby. You have to keep your head high. And you have to surround yourself with people that love you to show you how to love yourself and then share that love with everyone else.
Thank you. So I will get to that video in a second. And first, I'm just going to read a letter that I wrote for my sister at the beginning of the book, sort of my words of love for her as well. And so I'm going to share the letter that I wrote for Chloe. Dear Chloe, my beautiful, powerful little sister. Oh. Should I go? Can you guys hear me over that? Okay. When I was 18, a couple months before I started college, you burst into this world, a bundle of energy ready to take up space and radiate love. You are so full of life, Chloe, so it seems only fitting that your hair is equally alive. Your afro reaches for the sun, and the sun grazes its tips. When you run on the beach, tracing the outlines of recent waves, your hair becomes alive. It bounces and dances and sings. Your hair hugs your face, holds it tight, whispers in your ear to remind you that you are the descendant of Africans, of Africa. You and I have different white mothers, but we are connected by our Black father, by our Black ancestors, brought from Africa in chains to the Caribbean. The power, the strength, the eventual liberation of our ancestors live within us. I am grateful for our Blackness because our Blackness makes us powerful, makes us sisters. When Dad called to tell me you were ashamed of your afro, I became furious at the world for making you feel this way. Some people say that change must be gradual, that Black girls with natural hair must be patient as the media slowly but surely begins giving us a hint of representation here and there. But I don't believe in gradual change. So I took matters into my own hands because you matter. And you deserve to know today that your natural crown is beautiful. So I want to lead by example. I want to teach you how to love yourself by loving myself, by introducing you to other Black women who love themselves. As Black women, we have to stop waiting for the world to love us, and we have to start loving ourselves unconditionally. Chloe, I want you to know that I love you unconditionally. But more importantly, I want you to love yourself unconditionally. Your sister, St. Clair. So that's the letter that I wrote for my sister. And I think that for me, it's really important to model that sense of self-love for her so that she has an example and so that she has an example in me and in all of these other women who I interviewed of what it looks like to love yourself in a Black body. And I think that that's important for all of us when it comes to representation, to find people who share our identities, people who are older than us, and see what self-love looks like in them, to have that example of self-love, to know that we also have a right to love ourselves regardless of what society says. And so as I was working on this book, I interviewed women from all over the country. I live in DC, so a lot of people on the East Coast, but also out West, South, Midwest, kind of all over the place. And I really got to practice, I would say, deep empathy and storytelling and what it means to really listen to people's stories. And some of the women as well were not only from different states, but a few of the women were from different countries, or their families were from different countries. And so even though everyone shared this identity of being a Black woman, within that identity, there are so many different intersections as well. And so I really got to hear a range of different stories, a range of different perspectives. And one of the big things that came out of this process for me was thinking about vulnerability and what it means to be vulnerable and find spaces where we can share our stories, find people who we feel safe around and who we know we can tell our stories to, and they will treat our stories with love and respect and not with any kind of judgment. And so really important to find spaces where our stories are valued and when we can use that first person I for storytelling. And so I'm going to share a couple examples of this vulnerability with you all. So I'll share this example first, this picture that's up on the screen, and then I'll share the next video after this photo. So this photo is 3 young women in New York City. They were just about to graduate high school. They were seniors in high school, just a few days away from graduating. And they were really close friends over the past 4 years. And their high school only had a 2% Black population. So again, this feeling of not fully belonging in a space, right? Of being around a majority of people who don't share one of your identities. And so they said, in large part because of that, they had grown really close over the past 4 years, being part of this very small 2% Black population. And yet, even though they were really close, there were still things that came up during our conversation that they hadn't shared with each other before. And so in a way, I think that together we were able to sort of go to an even deeper, to a deeper understanding of each other and allow ourselves to be even more vulnerable. And so, I asked these women to share their hair stories. They shared their hair stories, how they learned to love their natural hair. And then I asked if there were other parts of their identities or challenges around self-love that they wanted to talk about also. And so that's when they started opening up about other struggles that they faced as well. So one of the women said that in addition to having to learn to love her hair, she also struggled to learn to love her body. And this was something that came up when I asked you guys to talk about what you love about yourselves or what you're still learning to love. I think that a lot of us really at times can struggle to learn to love our bodies and how they look, and we're taught to constantly judge ourselves. So one of these women shared that in high school, she had had a really difficult time learning to love her weight. She was really self-conscious about it. She developed a really difficult relationship with food, eventually had an eating disorder, and really had to take the time to learn to love her body weight. And this was her first time sharing that with me, but also with the 2 other women, with her 2 closest friends. And so when she had the courage to be vulnerable in that way, one of the other young women shared that she had also gone through a similar experience of feeling really ashamed about her weight in high school and having to learn to love her weight, also had a difficult relationship with food, and talked about how she overcame that as well. And then when these 2 women open up, the third woman shared that she didn't necessarily experience that, but she had struggled a lot with colorism, because as we know, even in communities of color, there still can be a lot of colorism, and people with darker skin tones often face even more discrimination. And so she said that she really struggled to learn to love her darker skin tone. And at one point in high school, she actually started purchasing skin bleaching cream to lighten parts of her body, to lighten her skin. And so she used that skin bleaching cream on her elbows, knees, knuckles, certain parts of her skin for a while. And it wasn't until her dad noticed that something was off and addressed that she was able to begin to learn to love her skin color. And I thought that this was obviously really heartbreaking to hear these stories, but it was also, I think, a really powerful and empowering experience for us to be there together in that space and to connect over our hair journeys, because that was something we all shared, struggling to learn to love our hair, but then also opening up about these other aspects that they struggled with as well. And so I think it's important to surround yourself with people who maybe share your same struggles, and then also just with people in general who are willing to listen and who will take your stories, will receive your stories with love. And there's a metaphor that I think about sometimes when I think about the burden that so many people from marginalized communities or people with oppressed identities face. And so it has to do with a glass of water. Some of you may have heard this metaphor before. So if you think about holding up a glass of water for, say, a minute, it's not that heavy, right? You can probably hold it. If you have to hold that glass of water for an hour, it's gonna start to weigh you down a bit. And then if you have to hold that glass of water for a day, it's gonna become really heavy. And if you have to hold the same glass of water year after year after year, the weight of it is gonna become almost unbearable, even though it's just this little glass of water. And so this glass of water is what I think about when I think about the weight that so many of us with oppressed identities grow up carrying, of believing that we are not enough, of believing that our bodies are not enough, of believing that our identities are not worthy of love. And so I think that when we allow ourselves to share our stories and to open up about who we are, I think that this glass of water becomes a lot less heavy because we no longer have to carry it alone, right? We can share it with other people, we can share it with our communities, and then it becomes much less of a burden, I think. And so storytelling for me is really important. And that was something I really saw in this conversation with these three women. And I have one more example of vulnerability from the book that I want to share with you all. And it's just a short video of a woman who I didn't really know ahead of time. We had only met a couple days before, but she really opened up and was vulnerable. And I was really grateful for that. So I'll share her video if we can get that pulled up. Thank you.
The way that Black women's hair has been manipulated in the media, in mainstream media, just, I guess by corporate American lives. And unfortunately, it was hard growing up and feeling different. You get bullied or teased or made fun of because you're different. I didn't ever really think about, who's white and who's Black and who's this and who's that. Like, I just never thought of things in terms like that. I just looked at people for artists. But it's not how our world is,
Thank you. So this idea of vulnerability really stuck with me as I was working on the book. And I think it goes for anybody who has been discriminated against, right? Thinking about how we can be vulnerable and open up these parts of ourselves and realize that when we do allow ourselves to be vulnerable, that's actually a really empowering experience oftentimes. And we're taught sometimes that vulnerability is a weakness, but it really is, I think, a huge strength. So another topic that came up as I was working on this book was this idea of hair as it relates to ancestry. So I think that for a lot of the women who I interviewed who are African-American or Afro-Caribbean or just in general Black folks in the diaspora who don't necessarily know where our roots in Africa are, I think that for many of us, it's easy to feel disconnected from our past, from our heritage, because we don't know much about it, because when our ancestors were brought to this side of the world, everything was stripped from them. So language, spirituality, culture, traditions, hair traditions, knowledge about how to take care of our hair, all of that was stripped from our ancestors. And sometimes even hair itself was stripped. So sometimes in the US, enslaved people would be forced to have their heads shaved. And so there was this literal stripping of even hair. And this was really significant, especially because in a lot of African tribes, hairstyles would be used to denote really important parts of their identities. So gender, age, marital status, what tribe they were from, whether they were mourning or grieving at the time. And so all of this was really stripped. And so I think in large part because of this, it can feel difficult to feel connected to our past, to our ancestry, to where we come from. And so some of the women who I talked to for this book said that they feel like their hair is a way of reclaiming this ancestry that has been taken away and sort of this connection that has attempted to be severed between us and our past. And so some of the women talked about how no matter how many years, decades, centuries we have of colonization and colonialism and white supremacist systems and these patriarchal systems, no amount of that can take away this gift of hair that our ancestors continue to pass down to us. And so I'm going to share a letter that one of the women in the book wrote to my little sister around this idea of hair and ancestry. And this is the woman on the screen who wrote the letter. Dear Chloe, you stand on the shoulders of great women. We are the first. All life came out of Africa, and your hair is a symbol and representation of a greatness that is yours to tap into. When you wear your hair in its natural state, you're tapping into greatness. And those of us whose ancestors survived the Middle Passage, we're survivors. We have some powerful genes, and that ain't nothing to play with. Your sister, Elise. So I think this is a really great idea in general, not just in the Black community, but in general, again, for anybody with marginalized identities. I think that when we tap into our most authentic selves, there is a sense of greatness there when we can fully embrace, when we allow ourselves to fully embrace who we are at our core. And so this idea of hair as identity really struck with me, really struck me in terms of thinking about how I can remain rooted in my community, in my history, in my heritage. Because, as the saying goes, when you know where you come from, you know where you're going. And so I think it's difficult sometimes to know where we're going if we don't feel rooted in a past. And so this was significant to me. And then another theme that sort of came up was this idea of hair as it relates to identity. And so I'm going to share a couple videos. So not the next video. I'm going to skip the next video, but I'm going to go to the video after that. Thanks. So the video that I'm going to share now features one of the women describing her hair. And she described it as sturdy and standing up on its own. And obviously within the Black community, we all have different hairstyles, hair textures, but I really like this idea of her hair standing up on its own and being sturdy because it, for me, is a metaphor for the Black community as a whole, as we've had to be very sturdy and stand up on our own over the centuries to endure everything that we've endured and to not just survive, but also really to thrive. And so I'll share her video first with you all.
Having straight hair is a lot of work, having to like straighten it all the time and like make sure that like I had covered the braid and all of that. It was just a lot of work. And I really love braid naturally. It's pretty low maintenance, even though a lot of people would say otherwise. Because it's so thick, like it can just like stand up on its own. It's very like sturdy in a way. I just like letting your hair do it.
Thank you. And then I'll share the next two videos, which also have to do with this idea of hair and identity and fully embracing ourselves.
Before, I feel like I was always trying to tame my hair. I just didn't feel happy if my hair was not straight. Now I have 5 years, 5 years natural, and now I'm here. And I love it, and it feels like now people know me because of my hair. The bigger my hair gets, the more beautiful I think it is. It's such a part of who I am.
my hair speaks for itself. It speaks about who I am, about my value, about how I decide to portray myself to the world, and that's like I'm my natural self, right? It's like I wake up in the morning and my hair has something new to tell me. Sit with your hair for like an hour or two and play with it, figure out what it's like, figure out what it's about, what it's trying to tell you. Just literally look in the mirror and say, I love my hair. I'm different, but I love it. I don't have to look like everyone else. I don't have to have straight hair. I don't have to be beautiful in that way because your curls are beautiful. Your hair is definitely a part of you. So let it be a part of your spirit.
You. And that should be it for the videos. So as I'm talking all about self-love and embracing your most authentic self, I also want to acknowledge how difficult that can be because as we all know, oftentimes there is a lot of pushback for embracing who we are and embracing these parts of our identities that don't necessarily fit within the mainstream narrative. And so there were some women who I talked to throughout the process of creating this book who talked about how difficult it was to sort of deal with that societal pressure. So there was one woman who I talked to who said that her dad actually stopped talking to her for several months when she went natural because he was so upset with her decision to embrace her natural hair. And that was really hard for her, but she decided to just stick with it anyways and sort of, again, find that self-love from within. And then, so I think, I share that story to say it's really important to think about within our own communities, how we can be supportive of each other, how we can make sure that others know that we are a safe space for them to share their full, authentic selves, for them to share all parts of their identities with us. And also how we can find people also who will accept us, not just tolerate, but really embrace and love us for all of who we are as well. And then sort of on a larger societal scale, there was another woman who is a friend of mine. She had a relaxer and she was going to go natural. She was going to do the big chop. She was going to, cut off all her relaxed hair. And she was really excited about it to, do this thing that she'd been wanting to do for a long time, finally get rid of the straight hair. And she had her hair appointment scheduled at the salon. And I was going to go with her to photograph her and then photograph her doing the big chop and then include her interview, her story in my book. But the day before she was scheduled to go in for her appointment, she decided against it and she canceled it because she was worried about the negative ramifications that going natural could have on her job, especially because she works in a very straight, white, male dominated field in the government. And she was worried that, especially as a darker skinned Black woman, that having natural hair on top of that would really negatively impact her future career opportunities, promotional opportunities, financial opportunities. And so she actually made the decision to keep her hair relaxed, and it's still relaxed today. And I share this story to share that so often, I think we have to, all of us in this room, for one reason or another, or possibly for multiple reasons, feel like we have to minimize pieces of our identities, that we have to conform in order to fit in order to not face any additional discrimination because of who we are at our core. And so I think that this can be really challenging. And can really oftentimes limit our ability to fully embrace ourselves while also trying to survive in this world. And so I think about how the political impacts the personal, and earlier, people were talking about voting. And so when we think about politics in the history of this country, there's been so much policing against people with marginalized identities. So again, with Black hair, for example, there's this long history of policing. In the 1700s, there were the Tignon laws in Louisiana, which stated that any Black woman, whether she was enslaved or even if she was free, legally had to cover her hair in public. So it was illegal for Black women to show their hair in public spaces. So there was this literal policing, this illegality of embracing Black women's full selves. And then even in recent times, it's still been a struggle to quote unquote legalize Black hair. And so it wasn't until 1976 that the Afro became protected under the Civil Rights Act. And 76 is pretty recent history when we think about it. And then there are still other traditionally Black Afrocentric hairstyles that can still face legal discrimination. So dreadlocks, for example, is still legal in many states to discriminate against people with dreadlocks. There was a court case around this in 2013 of a Black woman who was told by her job that she had to get rid of her dreadlocks in order to work for them. And she took them to court, and she actually ended up losing the case. And the court found that her job did have the right to deny her employment because of her locks. And so in recent years, there's been the Crown Act, which is legislation to ban any kind of race-based hair discrimination. And so it's being passed in various states across the country. And I think it's important, right, on a political level that we're telling our legislators what policies we want in place. And it's really important to have policies, as we know, that allow all of us to embrace ourselves as we want to. And so I'm going to sort of circle back to this idea of storytelling, because one of the strategies that the folks behind the Crown Act have been using is storytelling. So they've been having people across the country, in particular people in the Black community, go to these legislators, to these lawmakers, these congresspeople, and share their first-person experiences of race-based hair discrimination. And I think that this is really significant, that they're using storytelling as a tool to sort of move the needle and change the narrative around Black hair, because it shows that our stories matter and that our stories do have the power to create change, and our personal voices, our personal stories really do hold a lot of weight. And one of the campaigns that the Crown Act recently did was called the As Young as 5 campaign. And so they had people share stories, first-person stories of being discriminated against on the basis of hair, starting from when they were at least as young as 5 years old. And so to me, this was a significant campaign because it made me go back to my little sister and think about how she was bullied for her natural hair when she was just 4 years old. And so I think that, again, storytelling is really important. And now my sister is a bit older, she's 10. And so I've shared all of these stories with her. I've shared the book with her. And she has, I think, really been able to see herself and her story reflected in these women. And so because of that, she's come to really a place of self-love around her hair, where she loves and embraces her afro now. The picture you saw, her afro is probably twice as big now. And it's really beautiful to see that sense of self-love, especially at such a young age. I know, at least for me, I can look back at myself at 10, and I definitely didn't have the amount of self-love that she has now. And so I think that it really shows the power that we all have, the power that everybody in this room has to use your own story to uplift someone else. So even if maybe it took some of us longer to embrace our hair, our identity, our sexuality, whatever it is, we can now use our own stories to help other people love themselves from an even earlier age. So we can use our own experiences to inspire others. And so with that being said, I do want to talk about another project around storytelling that I'm working on now. And it's a very different topic, but it still goes around this idea of storytelling and first personal narratives and what happens when our identities are policed, right? So how do we fully embrace ourselves in a world that tries to delegitimize and make illegal parts, these essential parts of who we are? And so this next book that I'm working on, not about Black hair, it's about immigration. And it's still in the works, but I've really learned a lot creating this project. And so I've been interviewing people from all over the world and asking them about an object that they've brought with them from their home country. And I have really gotten, I would say, a diverse range of immigrants. And I've asked them to share their stories with me. And so many people, what's interesting or what has really stood out to me is that so many people come to this country for safety, for protection. But that can be really difficult, as a lot of us know who are not immigrants. Just because you have citizenship in this country doesn't necessarily mean that you're safe, because there is so much discrimination against so many different communities here. And so that is what some of these immigrants have shared as well in terms of facing discrimination. And these immigrants have talked about being at the intersection of immigration and LGBTQ identity, and sometimes other sort of parts of themselves as well. And so I just want to share a couple of their stories with you all. So I'm going to pull up their images here and then read some excerpts for you all. So, all right, so this is the first person. He is from Russia. He is an asylee from Russia, and he came here because of Russia's anti-LGBTQ laws. And so this is what he said in the interview, short excerpt. "It was very difficult in the beginning. My English wasn't good. I didn't have documents to work. I had no ideas about my future. I was depressed. I was lost. I missed my country. And I blamed myself. Maybe if I wasn't queer, maybe if I wasn't an LGBTQI activist, then I wouldn't have been fired from my university and blacklisted from other jobs in Russia. I remember standing in the subway in New York City one day, and as I watched the trains go by, I thought, if I jump right now, who would care?" The next excerpt is from a former Vietnamese refugee, and this one's a bit longer. "There were so many of us young kids that the adults decided to drug us so we'd fall asleep and wouldn't scream and cry, which could have alerted Vietnamese authorities that we were escaping the country on a small handmade boat without permission. I was 2, maybe 2.5, so I have no memory of this. But the story goes that once we found Malaysia, they wouldn't let us on the island, even though it was a refugee camp. So my family chopped up the little boat so they'd be forced to accept us. We were there for about 1.5 years before coming to the US as refugees. And during that time, this picture was taken. When I look at this photo, I'm drawn to my mother because she looks so young. She had me on her 30th birthday, and I was kid number 6. Plus, she was pregnant with my younger sister in this photo. Like, can you imagine the sheer amount of courage she had to have to live this life? To flee her country with her 6, almost 7 kids on a boat. She just had that quiet courage. As a kid, of course, you don't really appreciate these stories and all the sacrifices that your parents are making for you. But my mom, she sacrificed everything for her kids. In her head, her first identity was always a mother. This was why she was here on Earth, to be our mother. It was never to be Dang Tran. When my mom was diagnosed with stage 3 of thyroid cancer, the doctors gave her 2 years to live, but she gave us 5. And I think the reason she lasted as long as she did was because she saw it as her duty to make sure all her kids graduated college and stepped into adulthood. She held on until just 2 months before my little sister finished undergrad. That was, hands down, the biggest loss of my life. It was also complicated, though, because my family expected me to grow up as a traditional Vietnamese woman. But I was the daughter who wouldn't shut up, who was headstrong and stubborn, who insisted on playing sports instead of cooking. And then in the heart of my mom's battle with cancer, I realized I was gay. There was no way I was going to lay this information on her. The last thing I needed was to cause her stress. I wanted her to focus all her energy on healing. So I left our home in New Jersey to pursue my master's degree in Ohio because I wanted to explore this part of my identity without worrying about how it would affect my mother. It was a difficult decision because it meant missing the last few years of her life. Some people might think that I was a coward who wanted to run away from her problems, but I only did it to protect my mom. And if I were given this choice again, I'd hide myself every single time for her. She'd never been too verbal about her love for me, but the last time I saw her before she passed, as I was getting my stuff ready to go back to Ohio after visiting her, she pulled my head next to hers and said, "I love you and I miss you when you go away." No matter what, I will always consider myself very much my mother's daughter. I still want to make her proud. The hope is that when I finally see her at the pearly gates, she says, "You did good, kid." And then I have one more excerpt. This guy is a little explicit. I hope that's okay. All right. He says, "My parents had queer friends in Mexico who they loved and respected, and they have queer friends here who they love and respect. When I was 10, my dad heard me call someone the F word because I was 10 and didn't know any better. And he stopped me and said, 'I can't believe you would ever use that word. I don't want to ever hear you say anything bad about gay people again.' And I remember when we watched Ellen come out on television, and my mom went, 'Wow, what a brave woman. What an inspiring story.' And then she turned to me and was like, 'Don't get any fucking ideas.' You know? And when I eventually came out to my parents, it was not a good scene. But an older friend of mine said, 'Your parents don't hate you. They've just been brainwashed. But if you don't give up on them, they won't give up on you.' I wasn't close to my parents for about 10 years after I came out, but I kept coming back and knocking on their door once a month and saying, 'Hi, I still love you. Don't like me? Okay, bye, but I will come back.' And I feel like once they saw that I wasn't giving up on them, they realized that they were the ones being dicks, and they slowly started to realize that maybe this isn't the hill they needed to die on. My parents and I are as close as can be now. When my younger brother got married, both of my parents came up to me separately because they're divorced now and told me that they wanted me to get married one day too. They were like, 'Gay marriage is legal now. Can we get a son-in-law for fuck's sake?' My mother told me to find a handsome man, and then she added, 'with money, because you're broke.' But you know, she's supportive of my art now too. The other day, which means almost a year ago, my mother came to a show of mine. We were doing a staged reading of my graphic novel about queer superheroes, and at the beginning of the show, I asked the audience who their favorite superheroes were. And people screamed out, you know, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. And my brother told me later that in the audience, my mom whispered to him, 'Your brother.' And when my brother asked her why, she said, 'He's never taken no for an answer, and he's always put his dreams first.' So that's the third excerpt that I wanted to share with you all. And this book has been really eye-opening for me because I feel like I get to hear people with so many different stories. And I think that storytelling is really important because when we talk about politics, it's easy to deny someone's political opinion or to go against a political belief. But it's much harder, I think, to deny someone's own personal experience when they're sharing that. And so, right, you can say, 'Oh, I'm against this law being passed,' but you can't be against, it's much harder to be against someone's own lived first person story that they're sharing. And even within the process of creating this book, there was another person who I talked to who is cis and straight. And he talked about how he has really become an ally. He talked about he's a skateboarder, professional skateboarder, and he talked about how in the skateboarding community, back in Angola and then also here now in the US, it really brings together people from all different backgrounds. And so he's really gotten to hear stories as he's connected with them through sports. He's gotten to hear stories from all different kinds of people. And he said that because of this experience and because of hearing other people's first person stories, he's really changed his views in terms of the LGBTQ community. And again, to me, I think that really speaks to the power of storytelling and the power that we all have with our own voices to change the narrative and to make people understand us and to understand who we are. And so with that being said, I know we only have 5 minutes left, but hopefully we'll have time for this quickly. I just wanted to do one more short exercise with you all around this idea of identity. And so I was going to ask everybody to step into a circle, but if that feels like too much work for you all, I'll just have you guys raise your hands instead of stepping into a circle. Do you guys have a preference? Hands? I see a hand. Okay. All right, we'll do hands. So I'm sure that some of you have probably done an exercise like this before. Here we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you all to raise your hand if you have ever felt out of place because of these identities that I'm going to call out. Okay, sorry, let me get my papers together. All right, so I want you to raise your hand if you've ever felt out of place in your life because of your race. And I should also mention that participation is totally optional. So if anybody doesn't want to raise their hand at all, please don't feel any pressure. All right, thanks. Step into this, or sorry, raise your hand if you've ever felt out of place because of your ethnicity. Right. Raise your hand if you've ever felt out of place because of your skin color. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your facial features. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your gender. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your sexuality. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of the way you speak or the languages that you speak. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your immigration status. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your height. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your weight. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your age. Raise your hand if you felt out of your place, out of place because of your religion. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your socioeconomic status. And then raise your hand if you felt out of place because of an ability or disability. All right, are there any groups that I didn't mention that anybody wants to call out for people to raise their hands? Okay, great, thank you. How many people, raise your hand if you have felt out of place because of your lack of a religion? Thanks. Anyone else want to call one out? All right. Oh, what did you say? Personality. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your personality. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of a neurodivergence. Anyone else? Interest. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your interests. Oh, like because you're a parent? Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your parental status. Anyone else? Oh, what'd you say? Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your familial status. Oh, someone said, can you elaborate? Thanks. All right, and then I heard one other one somewhere over here. Raise your hand if you felt out of place because of your career path. Yeah. Anyone else? If you've felt out of place because of how you dress. Anyone else? All right, thank you guys so much for adding all of those. I appreciate it. So I think that we are, out of time. It's 12:01. But I want to sort of end and encourage everybody to continue sharing your stories and to continue thinking about how you can use your own identity to uplift and empower others. So thank you all so much for having me. I'm really, again, grateful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you again to our wonderful keynote speaker. And Danielle, if you want to come up here really quick. To the both of you. On behalf of the conference planners, supporters, MTSU Lambda Association, the College of Behavioral and Health Sciences, and the Conference Advisory Board, thank you for your support of our efforts to present this worthwhile event. We want to especially thank you for your commitment to standing strong, and we ask that you accept this small token of our appreciation.